"That body isn't your son's!" The girl yelled at the millionaire in front of a body covered by a black bag, but when they remove the bag, they discover something terrible. Comment and rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream cut through the hot afternoon in the small historic town like a sharp blade, echoing through the cobblestone streets until it reached the ears of the businessman watching from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the yellow house across the street, a 2-story colonial revival with peeling blue shutters. The 52-year-old man adjusted his Italian silk tie as he turned his eyes away from the window, trying to concentrate on the documents spread across his mahogany desk. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was used to solving complex problems involving millions in investments and delicate negotiations on Wall Street, but he preferred to stay away from the dramas of his neighbors, especially after 5 years of living alone since he lost his wife in circumstances that still haunted him in the silent early mornings. Across the street, inside the colonial revival house that smelled of mildew and cheap whiskey, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen. Her big, frightened eyes followed every move of the 38-year-old woman holding a metal spoon over the flames of the gas stove. The aunt had been drinking since noon at the corner bar, O'Malley's, and her red eyes gleamed with a rage the child couldn't understand. "You're a curse on this house," the woman hissed, her voice slurred from the alcohol she consumed daily since she lost her job at City Hall. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's thin arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her delicate skin. The child bit her lower lip hard, trying to stifle her cries. She had learned through months of suffering that crying loudly only made the punishment worse. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, that song she used to sing before bed. It was all that remained now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in moments of greatest pain. "Stop whining and go to your room," the aunt ordered, putting the spoon away as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I don't want to see you until tomorrow, and if you smear the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll get a real punishment." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix hanging on the cracked wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum that song softly, her only source of solace. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that specific melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His late wife used to hum it while she made dinner, a popular tune about free birds flying through the skies. But where was it coming from now? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial revival house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there escaped that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, awakening memories he preferred to keep buried under piles of financial reports and profit spreadsheets. He remembered a clerk who had worked for him years ago, a kind woman who always hummed that same song while organizing documents in the office. The woman had resigned abruptly 5 years earlier, leaving only a formal letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, too absorbed in his own pain and the obsessive need to immerse himself in work until he felt nothing anymore. But now, that familiar melody coming from a house where a child was clearly suffering stirred an unease he couldn't ignore. In the house next to the colonial revival, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the wealthy businessman, she could no longer pretend she didn't notice the worrying signs. During 40 years of teaching children, she had developed a keen instinct for identifying child suffering. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench tightly. She watched the windows of the neighbor's house with growing concern. She had known the family who lived there for decades. The woman who was now taking care of her niece had always been troubled, but since she had taken custody of the orphaned child, something had changed dramatically in the air of that residence. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the cobblestone streets like the other children in town. It was as if she were a ghost, existing only in the shadows. The teacher dried her hands on her floral apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been too long since their last proper conversation, and maybe it was time to get to know the little girl who lived there in suspicious silence better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened thoughts he struggled to process. Memories of the clerk who had disappeared from his life, of the wife he had tragically lost, of the loneliness he had chosen as a shield against any emotional connection. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep on the cold floor of the room, exhausted by physical and emotional pain. Her small fingers clutched the worn sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the bird she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. They were always birds, symbols of a freedom she could barely imagine, but that her 4-year-old heart desperately craved. Across the street, the businessman closed the expensive drapes and tried to return to the financial reports waiting for his attention. But he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand, but that bothered him like a pebble in his shoe. For the first time in 5 years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own tinted windows and his world of accumulated assets and stock investments. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent years running from any emotional responsibility, and in the conscience of a teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. Neither of them knew yet that their lives were about to intertwine in unexpected ways, nor that the coming months would test limits they never imagined needing to face. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the town awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with special care. There was something in that child's voice that didn't leave her alone, an echo of despair she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Colonial Revival House. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The woman who opened it had a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a visit. It's been so long since we had a proper chat." The homeowner hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the other to back away. "And I would love to meet your niece. I hear she's an adorable little girl." The woman's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick, high fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the movement of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no," she replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her, even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families were there, screaming for attention. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former clerk. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Colonial Revival House, a strange curiosity invaded him. The educator finally said goodbye, but not before casting an investigative look inside the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her residence, she decided she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Colonial Revival House, the homeowner locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" growled the aunt, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The woman laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the dirt and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her impossible dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the backyard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So, she began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort at that moment of abandonment. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him he might need that evidence. While recording, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. The clerk who worked for him used to hum that same song while organizing files. She had been exemplary until she disappeared abruptly, leaving only a formal resignation letter, and she always spoke fondly about her little girl, a girl named... The cell phone trembled in his hands when the connection finally formed in his brain. The clerk's daughter was named exactly as the name he had heard being shouted in that house days ago. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing from his life. How hadn't he made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment filled with expensive furniture bought with the wealth accumulated over decades. He vaguely remembered the clerk mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, growing financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the conflicts with his wife, the crises in the company that required constant attention, that he hadn't paid due attention to the signs that she needed help. Now, 5 years later, that woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including deep regret for not having helped when he clearly should have noticed that something was wrong. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time the businessman did not turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Colonial Revival House he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination and a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. What he saw through the device screen made him nauseous. The woman was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gestured violently towards a small figure he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the hot afternoon, and this time he couldn't pretend they were just common childhood tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? He had spent 5 years hiding from the world, building emotional walls as high as the buildings his company erected, accumulating wealth in investments and applications while letting his humanity wither. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child wrapped herself in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of unbearable pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. He had become an expert in avoiding emotional responsibilities, in staying away from anything that could make him feel again. But that little girl, the daughter of someone who once trusted him as an employer, was suffering while he watched from his ivory tower built with fortunes and investments on Wall Street. For the first time in 5 years, he wondered if all that money, all that accumulated wealth, all that business success really meant anything if he couldn't even help a child who lived just a few yards away. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt was consuming him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew on his cell phone, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few yards from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in that colonial revival residence. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the neighboring house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and dirty underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Good Lord," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," she said with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetie," replied the educator, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The girl looked quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house, calling the girl aggressively. The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the educator needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that screamed for help. The educator remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the absolute fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him nauseous. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest, replacing the emotional inertia that dominated him. The former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family who lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by the very cowardice he had cultivated as a defense mechanism. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best clothes and drove to the Colonial Revival House again. This time, she would not take no for an answer. The homeowner answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "I already said it's not a good time." "Honey, I insist on getting to know the little girl better," interrupted the teacher firmly. "As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the woman could protest, the educator had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom had given her. The interior of the residence was gloomy and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the homeowner, blocking the way to the back. "What a pity." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher. But her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that appeared to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The two women froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," said the homeowner quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always next door if you need anything at all." The tone made it clear that it was not just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the visitor left, the homeowner locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already gleaming with familiar rage. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The woman took the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew exactly what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions. You think I don't know how to take care of you." Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. The clerk had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted to or not. His wealth accumulated in investments and stocks, his fortune built over decades, all that meant nothing if he couldn't protect an innocent child. He picked up the phone and made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, a discreet and efficient man who had helped build his capital and business empire. "I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be an urgent matter." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to sneak out into the backyard. Her new burns were burning terribly, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her little heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months of silent suffering, someone was truly paying attention. And that in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine in her most hopeful dreams. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's condo on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at college almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call from the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said the lawyer, sitting in the spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad from his leather briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, total neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to report it immediately to the appropriate authorities." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his tired face. "But there's something else. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why. But now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously?" "But sometimes, at other times too," replied the businessman, picking up his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a professional specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today." "I'm going to contact the appropriate authorities. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men were planning the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. "How many times do I have to tell you not to dirty the walls?" screamed the woman, holding the girl's arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't completely understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the narrow hallway. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll get a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that residence. She stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak but loaded with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, she made a definitive decision. Instead of going to the grocery store, she went directly to the small downtown area where the office of the Child Protection Authorities was located. "I need to talk about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The counselor, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children, raised her eyes from the papers she was analyzing. During her 5 years in office, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person to make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," she said, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher was reporting her detailed observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting with the district attorney. The professional listened attentively while the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the district attorney, examining the videos. "I will determine an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked the lawyer, worried. "With this evidence? We can act today," replied the district attorney. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now." That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints reached the authorities on the same morning. The counselor was finishing writing down the teacher's account when her phone rang. "I just received another complaint about the same house," she said, looking at the teacher with surprise. 2 independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The counselor, accompanied by 2 social workers and a bailiff, was heading to the street where the girl lived. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of emotional paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Colonial Revival House. In the residence, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the corner bar, O'Malley's, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the counselor knocked on the door of the Colonial Revival House and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations: a dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol impregnated in the walls, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room at the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the dark hallway. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetie," said the counselor, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anne. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had spoken to her in the yard. A flicker of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out her hand to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" The exit from the Colonial Revival House was a moment that would be etched in the memory of everyone present. The girl held tightly to the teacher's hand, her small and hesitant steps as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months. Her big eyes scanned the streets as if she was seeing the world for the first time. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene, a mixture of relief and emotion consuming his chest. For the first time in 5 years since he lost his wife, He felt that he had done something truly important, something that his wealth, his fortune accumulated in investments, could never buy. He had helped save a life. But the story would not end there. In the following months, the businessman would become deeply involved in the process of ensuring a safe future for the girl. He would discover, through careful investigations, that the child's mother had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving her daughter in the care of her troubled sister for lack of other options. The aunt would be permanently removed from custody and would receive treatment for her problems with alcohol. The retired teacher would offer to be the girl's temporary guardian, and the businessman, rediscovering a purpose he had lost, would become a constant presence in the child's life, helping financially and emotionally in her recovery. The girl would begin therapy to process the trauma she had experienced. Slowly, very slowly, she would smile for real again. Play as a 4-year-old child should play, draw birds no longer as symbols of escape, but as expressions of conquered freedom. And the businessman, who had spent 5 years running from emotional connections, buried in profit spreadsheets and financial investments, would discover that true wealth was not measured in accumulated assets or stock investments, but in the ability to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. He had lost his wife, but he gained a second chance to be human again, to remember that behind all those windows he watched daily, there were lives that deserved to be seen, heard, and protected. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.